Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Today's Past Forward conversation is in commemoration of the centennial of the Tulsa Massacre, which took place on May 31st, 1921. It is also inspired in part by our film, Going Back to T-Town, which tells the story of Greenwood, an extraordinary Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that once prospered despite rampant racism and hostile segregation. Torn apart in 1921 by one of the worst racially motivated massacres in our nation's history, the neighborhood, then known as Black Wall Street, rebuilt and rose from the ashes. By 1936, it boasted the largest concentration of Black-owned businesses in America. Ironically, Greenwood could not survive the progressive policies of integration and urban renewal of the 1960s. Going Back to T-Town is a film that was made for American Experience nearly 3 decades ago, and yet it is shockingly relevant today. The story of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre was hidden for generations, but as of last year, forensic experts began searching for the mass graves of the Black Tulsa citizens who were killed. This film features some of the last recorded eyewitness accounts from survivors of that atrocity. Today, we'll discuss the history of Tulsa's Greenwood community, the evolution of the narrative around the 1921 massacre, and the importance of capturing first-person accounts in telling the story of Greenwood's resilience and resurgence. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the chat box. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it's my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Carmen Fields is the producer and host of Higher Ground, a monthly half-hour television show on WHDH Boston that examines moral and ethical issues. She is also the writer of Going Back to T-Town and a Tulsa native. Karlos K. Hill is an associate professor and chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. His most recent book, The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History, seeks to make a visually compelling case for why it is so important for the events of that day to be talked about and framed as a massacre. Our moderator today is Jessica Marie Johnson. She is an assistant professor of history at the Johns Hopkins University. She is also the author of Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World. Thank you again, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo. Welcome, Carmen and Carlos. It is really wonderful to be here with you both today. Carmen, I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about how did this film come to be, especially given you have personal connections to the community. So how did that influence how the story was told?
Well, I have lived and worked in the Boston area for nearly 40 years now. At the time of the genesis of the film, I was working as an anchor, a news anchor at the PBS station in Boston. And after a quite casual conversation with the then executive producer, the late Judy Crichton, who expressed a desire to do some kind of story that looked at the interior of segregation. And so I began chatting about my home community, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and my segregated background. And she was intrigued and wanted a story that wasn't typically Southern. And Tulsa kind of represented any place USA, kind of the middle of the country. And she paired me with producers extraordinaire, Sam Pollard and Joyce Vaughn, to help develop a story about segregation. And the whole attention to the massacre was almost an accidental blessing, because that wasn't the focus that we went in terms of the story to tell.
I mean, the massacre, looms so large. I mean, so, one of the things we know, Karlos, about your work is that it's focused on telling the events of the massacre, helping us understand some of this history. Could you share maybe your reaction to the film and what struck you about how the story was told, how the history was told?
I think we owe a deep gratitude to Carmen for not just telling the story of the race massacre, but also centering the perspectives, the experiences, the vantage point of survivors, particularly in the time that she did this. The film, debuted, I believe, in the early 1990s, in 1993. And that was a time in which still this story was not well known, in Oklahoma, for all places in Oklahoma, as well as across the nation. But even with that, she centered the experiences of victim survivors and descendants. And they are the focal point of the film. And so, as I said to her before, she paved the way for historians like me to be able to tell this story because of the stories that she was able to collect and then sort of elevate and give significance to. And so, I owe her a deep amount of gratitude, and I think we all should, because of the ways in which she centered survivors in the telling of this most horrific, tragic story.
I mean, I completely agree, and I'm really honored to be here with you, Carmen. 100 years after the massacre, this marks the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And, as Karlos mentioned, historians have been doing some of this work. They believe that as many as 300 people were killed during the event. This is a horrific event. And, having the survivor stories there is so important because these families are still seeking justice and reparations for the damages and the losses suffered. So a little bit of the context, just to take us back 100 years, in the early 1900s, in response to segregationist laws in Oklahoma, a group of Black businessmen bought a small piece of land in the northeast part of Tulsa for their community. And so they called it Greenwood. And it was a place that Black residents could live, work, and thrive. It was independent of white Tulsa. By 1921, Greenwood's population is booming and its Black-owned businesses and institutions are really thriving. But there's that threat of violence. It's always present. And we're gonna watch a clip now from the film that speaks to a little bit of that.
By 1921, Tulsa's Black population had grown to almost 11,000, and the Greenwood community was booming. 15 grocery stores, 2 Black movie houses, 2 Black newspapers, 4 drugstores, 2 Black public schools, a Black public library, 4 barbecue and chili parlors, and about 13 churches.
In Tulsa, Oklahoma, we did have a little separate enclave where Blacks had some measure of financial, social, political independence, maybe even some clout.
You had a whole group of Black entrepreneurs who came together and formed a kind of union to help develop Black businesses.
The Black business grew so in Tulsa until in 1936 it was announced that we had the largest black business in the whole United States.
But when we went on the white side of towns now, you'd have white guys picking at you all the time, and you might get involved in a fight. And the Ku Klux Klans were pretty rampant.
It was a dangerous time to be black in America. Between 1917 and 1921, racial violence was rampant. In cities across the country, blacks were being beaten, burned, and lynched in alarming numbers. In Tulsa, the Ku Klux Klan included political leaders and members of the police. Even local newspapers supported mob violence.
It was always a hostile relationship between the black and white community, and part of it was because the Ku Klux Klan was located in an area just west of the black community itself on Main and Eastern. This was about 4 blocks west of where the primary black community was located. And we had to pass by this to go to places of employment and to go to and from school if we lived in service areas of the quarters. And it was just a hostile situation. There was always a potential for violence there.
They called Greenwood Black Wall Street. So Carmen and Karlos, what was so threatening about thriving black businesses in this time period?
Well, I'm not a studied scholar on it, but I imagine part of the problem was jealousy, because while the Black community seemed to be thriving by comparison, I imagine there were white people that were not, by comparison, doing as well. And that element was allowed to get out of control. It was also a period of just lawlessness in general, because the Ku Klux Klan was housed very near to the Black community, and those configuration of proximity and mentality helped fuel what happened.
And I would just piggyback on that and say, you know, Black Wall Street, or in 1921, the Negro Wall Street of America, was not just a prosperous Black community. It was a symbol. It was a symbol for what was possible, what was economically possible for Black people in Jim Crow America. And Booker T. Washington had this in mind when he frames Greenwood as the Negro Wall Street of America. It wasn't because there were banks, financial institutions, or a stock exchange in Greenwood. It was because of the businesses that existed there in 1921 and the rapidity with which the business community developed in Tulsa that gave hope to Black people, Black Southerners who mostly lived in poverty. You know, 80 to 90% of Black people work for whites, right, as sharecroppers. And so there you have the Greenwood district, a community that is 35 blocks that, and many of those blocks are owned, right, by Black people, home to Black businesses. It was a symbol of what was possible in Jim Crow America. And for whites, this symbol of Black prosperity could only lead to, in their minds and what they feared, social and political equality. And so it was a symbol for whites as well, for a time perhaps when Black people, Black communities such as Tulsa would rise up and demand social and political equality. And so as they are attacking the community, they're not just destroying buildings, they're not just killing people, they are attempting to kill an idea, a symbol of what was possible. They are saying, no, we will never live in an America where Black people are the equals to whites, that have the same rights as white people. That is what was destroyed or attempting to be destroyed. Booker T. Washington believed that over time, American racism would recede. And if it receded, communities such as Greenwood would exist and be plentiful. And so in that community being attacked as thoroughly as it was, in the way that it was, as quickly as it was about extinguishing that idea, that possibility. And so that was what was at stake in 1921, and that's what's still at stake in 2021. Will this community, this historic community, be able to flourish and prosper as it once was? What will the city and the state of Oklahoma do to ensure that Greenwood rises? And so that is what was at stake, and that's why the mob so viciously attacked this community.
Mm-hmm. And we can add without impunity, because to date, none of the troublemakers, murderers, rioters have been questioned, arrested, held to any account whatsoever. That's the travesty as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the massacre itself. On the night of May 31st, 1921, after a Black man is arrested for allegedly grabbing a white female elevator operator, the Black community feared a lynching. So they took up arms against a white mob waiting outside the courthouse where this man was being held. And the Black men who took up arms, they were ready to protect their families, but they were outnumbered. And the white mob moved in. As it moved in, it began to loot. It started setting buildings on fire. And by all accounts, it was just horrific. It was horrific and traumatizing for all of the Greenwood residents. In the aftermath, those who survived remained unbroken and resilient, and they were intent on rebuilding their community. So let's talk a little bit about a clip from the film that really, showcases and exemplifies this spirit.
During the riot, Black men had taken up arms to protect their families. Now they were charged with incitement, taken off to jail or the county fairgrounds, and tagged for identification.
And babies were born that night, 2 or 3 babies and everything. I had some personal friends that had a baby born the night before the riot started, and they lost that baby during the riot, trying to keep up with him. They had him in a shoebox, no, in some kind of box like a shoebox, and that baby got away from him. I never had any feeling. It was such a shock until, I don't know, that the Lord just strengthened me. But my husband he was so tender. He just broke down. He said, "Baby, we've lost everything we had." I said, "But we have each other, honey." I never shed a tear with him. In fact, I never have been angry. I felt sorry for the people that treated our folks like that.
The Red Cross recorded more than 300 people had been killed. Newspapers listed almost 100 deaths, but city officials put the death toll at 36. More than 35 blocks of Black Tulsa was burned to the ground. Over 4,000 people were left homeless. Still, most of the people of Greenwood refused to leave.
So this is, incredibly painful to watch, especially now, but also inspiring at the same time. Can you speak to the resilience of this community then and now? Either one of you.
Well, I think a large amount of credit goes to the father of the famed historian, John Hope Franklin. His father, Buck Franklin, was an attorney, and he urged everybody, rebuild, don't leave. If you have to rebuild with orange crates, I think he said, rebuild. And some of the witnesses in the film, or the storytellers, talk about having tents on their property and starting a fire to cook outdoors. And then if it started raining, you had to bring your stuff back indoors and then wait for the rain to go and go back and start over again. But there was an undertow, a determination, a resilience, a determination not to let this get us down. And you found that recounted over and over in lots of the stories. Not all of the stories, because I've learned since then, there were some that were so dispirited, they moved and started all over again in Chicago and other places. But I think part of the religious undergirding of the Black community was partly responsible, as well as just the sheer entrepreneurial spirit of a lot of people who remained.
And I would just add to that, as a historian of lynching and racial violence that focuses on Black resistance, what Black people did, Black individuals, Black people, Black communities did in response to racist terror, racist violence, is what I most enjoy talking about as it relates to this history. And so the race massacre and the ways in which survivors responded is as unprecedented as the violence that they experienced in communities, countless communities where Black people are attacked in very similar ways. The community does not rebuild. They simply do not rebuild. And it has nothing to do with reparations. It's because of the violence that they suffered. And the threat of future violence that they might suffer if they remained. And so it is unprecedented for a Black community to be attacked in the way that Tulsa, Greenwood is. And days later, they begin the process of rebuilding. And not only do they rebuild Greenwood, beginning in 1921, 20 years later, Greenwood, I would argue, experiences a golden age, a renaissance, where by 1940, there are more businesses and more Black people in Tulsa than there had been in 1921. That speaks to what Carmen is talking about, that faith, because they didn't know, they simply did not know, and perhaps lived in fear that another mob, aided and abetted by Tulsa authorities, would attack the community again. But despite that, they rebuilt, and not only rebuilt, Greenwood was bigger and perhaps more prosperous than it had been in 1921. And so the resilience, the faith, the grit and determination, because this is, Greenwood is still rebuilding. I know that because having visited historic Vernon AME Church, I know that part of their building campaign is to address the damages that were caused by the violence in 1921. And so there are entities in Greenwood that are still feeling the reverberations of this history today. And so for me, we would not be commemorating the 100th anniversary of the race massacre without people like B.C. Franklin, who refused to leave, encouraged others not to leave, prevented the city from from creating extending the fire ordinance that was downtown into Greenwood, which would have made it prohibitively expensive for survivors to rebuild. It's because of people like B.C. Franklin and others who just refused to be intimidated, remain, and because they remain, not only rebuilt, but made Greenwood bigger and perhaps more prosperous, that it's possible for us to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
And to just one little factoid on how difficult it was to rebuild, some of the lumber and brick organizations wouldn't sell to Black people in Tulsa. And people took trucks and went over to Arkansas and up into Missouri and Kansas and other places to bring back the provisions to rebuild their homes and their businesses. Also, is my understanding, no insurance was ever paid out to those that had been harmed. So, I mean, that undergirding of grit that Professor Hill talks about, it's amazing.
I mean, one of the things we're talking about in rebuilding has also been how the history is told and how language has been used around the massacre, because we're calling it a massacre, but it was called a race riot for a long time, for generations.
Yes.
Yeah. Can we talk about that change in language? Yeah.
And that nomenclature is more accurate. And I'm not sure that's been in the last few years if that came to pass, because the little knowledge I had growing up and up until most recently, it was referred to as the Tulsa Riot. And but I think massacre certainly is much more specific and correct in referring to it. But I wanted to mention, in light of no insurance or what have you, one thing that Going Back to T-Town, the documentary did, of which I'm very proud, it animated or reanimated a whole re-examination of what has happened, why it happened, what could or should be done. The late attorney Johnny Cochran and Harvard law professor Charles Ogletree, shortly after the documentary aired, began conversations and the process of filing lawsuits for reparations. A scholar in Tulsa, historian Eddie Faye Gates, immediately went to work doing oral history interviews with all of the survivors that she could find. And that was a very important part. And then the so-called Riot Commission was appointed, and other aspects of the massacre were examined, including what led to the current mayor of Tulsa, to order excavation of graves that are believed to be the massive graves of the people who were murdered, or some of the people who were murdered. And I'm particularly excited about the potential for a statewide curriculum to teach about the massacre in all of the public schools of Oklahoma. And I'm prayerfully awaiting and hoping that that does become the case, but fearful when you see the challenges to the 1619 Project and other such thinking. What does the future hold?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has been really critical in, even in thinking about curriculum and telling this history, you mentioned the accounts in the film of descendants of living witnesses, people who can offer a narrative that we might not otherwise have. I know, Karlos, you've been doing work with historical photographs connected to the massacre. Can we talk about some of these, the tools that are available to us, and why some of this was important in the filmmaking process for you, Carmen?
Well, as looking through a journalist lens, eyewitness accounts are always the most powerful. And one of the things we were determined in approaching telling the story of segregation or the interior of segregation. We wanted it in the voices of the people who actually lived it, as opposed to analysts or historians, although John O. Franklin happened to be a historian, but he was a Tulsa, grew up in Tulsa, or any such other prognosticators. It was important that the voice be of the actual people who witnessed it. And that was the task, identifying and finding, reaching out through churches, my parents' friends, friends of my classmates, churches, all the mechanism you go about looking for and identifying people. But the story in the actual words of those who experienced it was very important to us.
I would just add by saying that the two most powerful tools for helping people to understand what occurred 100 years ago are the survivor accounts, whether it was taken later by Mary Parrish, who referred to what occurred as not a riot, but a disaster. And that was purposeful in her in the first true history of the race massacre, events of the Tulsa disaster. She purposefully talks about it as a disaster and not a riot. And that was a clue to me that, you know, and talking about it as a riot, it was a way to obscure what had truly happened, which was the destruction, complete destruction of a community by a white mob, aided and abetted by local authorities, inclusive of the National Guard. And so survivor accounts tell the story of this as a massacre and as a disaster, but also photographs, I think, are the second most powerful way to understand what truly happened. And what drove me to create a book on this, around the photographs, is for me as a historian of lynching and racial violence, it's very hard often to help people understand the gravity and the scope of this violence. But these photographs bring into stark view what occurred. What does a 35 block area look like that's destroyed in less than 24 hours? The survivor counts can clue us into it, but the photographs help us to bring it to fruition, to understand tangibly what that looked like, what was left once the mob had invaded and destroyed the community. And so for me, it was about trying to take these two very powerful tools, the survivor accounts and the photographs, and making them work together. And my goal, because I know the photographs were mostly, or the photographs that have been archived were mostly taken by whites and were meant to tell the story of suppressing a quote unquote Negro rebellion. My hope, my theory of change in writing this book is that those same photographs that were meant to tell the story of suppressing a rebellion could be utilized with survivor accounts alongside it to tell a different story, to tell a victim, survivor, and descendant centered story. And so for me, there's a lot of resources out there, but if you truly want to understand, if you truly want to understand the depths of what occurred, you don't need to look any further than those oral histories and those photographs.
I mean, there is so much that has happened in this community, but we have to talk about what the Black community in Tulsa is like today. I mean, Karlos, you talked about the ways that they have been resilient in ways that are really historic in their own right. And Carmen, you've talked about the ways that, survivor testimony has been so important, and people in Tulsa and being accountable to them has been so important in telling the story. Can we talk about some of the ways that the residents have healed, and in what ways does healing still need to take place? What are their experiences today? How are they impacted by these events? Tell us a little bit, situate us in Tulsa today.
Well, I am not, of course, I'm not a resident of Tulsa, and I'm not as frequent a visitor as I was when my parents were still alive, but the Tulsa I see is still in turmoil, in the sense that I don't think there's been reconciliation or adjustment to what has happened. And I'm particularly intrigued. I read articles from time to time about the entrepreneurial efforts. And it appears that Blacks who want a toehold in that historic Greenwood district are being stymied in lots of institutional old ways and new ways in their efforts to remain true or remain a part of a Greenwood Greenwood community now as entrepreneurs.
You know, I had a conversation with Reverend Dr. Robert Turner, who is the pastor of historic Vernon AME Church in Greenwood. That is I think the oldest sort of Black institution in Greenwood, and according to Pastor Turner, the longest continuous landowner in the Greenwood district. Vernon AME is thought of as the grandmother of the Greenwood district of Black Wall Street. And so he said to me something very profound, because I asked him, I said, what are you doing right now as we lead up to the centennial to help your congregation, who is going to be inundated with questions from the media and both in the US and from without about this history? How are you helping them to deal with this? How are you helping them to heal in this moment? And he said to me very clearly, there can be no healing without restitution and reparations. Yeah. Healing is not possible. What we are doing right now is surviving. We are surviving without the healing that we need, right? This history, and particularly all of this attention to this history, has reopened this 100 years of wounds. And so these wounds cannot begin to heal unless the city of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, begins that process of healing by providing reparations and restitutions to the living survivors, but also to the community of Greenwood, because it wasn't just those individuals who deserve reparations and repair. It is the community. The community was attacked. The community was destroyed, and it was destroyed, aided and abetted by the city. And so the city owes a historic debt. If the race massacre represents the deadliest attack on a Black community, and it also represents the liquidation of Black wealth, intergenerational Black wealth, then in 2021, because there hasn't been restitution, there needs to be a historic investment in this community. And healing can't happen, as Pastor Turner would tell us, until, right, restitution and actually a reparations program is implemented. And until that happens, the wounds will remain open because the crime is so horrific. And so that's I think the way in which Pastor Turner sees this is the way I see it. We can't heal until.
And that's similar to the view that State Representative Regina Goodwin, who represents her district, is the Greenwood area, and she grew up on Greenwood, and her great-grandfather was one of the people involved or affected by the massacre. And her conversations with her colleagues at the State House are around, okay, do something. And what does it look like? Well, where do you want to start? And at this point, it's my understanding there have been no offers of so much as an apology, let alone taking the shape of reparations or scholarships or business loans or anything. And her plea is, well, do something. What does it look like? You know, let's talk about this together. Where do you want to start? And we
Yes.
can see.
I mean, at least business loans seem like that would make a lot of sense, particularly in this context. We're going to shift to questions from our audience watching live on Facebook and YouTube. We've got a ton of questions, and everybody is really interested in learning from you both. So we'll start with the first one. Are there any predominantly Black towns or communities in the United States that now have all Black businesses serving their communities?
Well, I'll defer to the scholar. I know there are some all Black towns in Oklahoma. My mother was born in Taft, Oklahoma, which is an all Black town, and Boley, Oklahoma, at one time was believed to be the oldest incorporated all Black entity in the country. I have no idea what the business ownership looks like in those communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I won't be able to answer this question satisfactorily, but I would just say that, you know, the history of Greenwood helps us to understand the ways in which Black business creation, when it's nurtured, can grow, can come to fruition, can sort of prosper. But we also see the ways in which racial violence, right, can completely thwart that and make it difficult, for Black economic advancement, and certainly accumulating intergenerational wealth. And so the story of Greenwood is one in which Black people rebuilt, businesses came back. The crown jewel of the Greenwood district, the Dreamland Theater, is rebuilt within a year or so of the massacre. Other businesses rebuild, but not all do. O.W. Gurley, arguably the founder of Greenwood, built the Gurley Hotel, owned a number of properties throughout the Greenwood district. He does not rebuild. J.B. Stratford is run out of Greenwood. He does not rebuild. The Greenwood that returns, that is rebuilt, is not the same Greenwood that existed in 1921. We have to be very clear about that. The wage earning potential of Black Tulsans, Black survivors, is not the same as it was in 1921. Black people are worse off, particularly heads of household are worse off in terms of their wage earning potential after the massacre, for decades after the massacre. It was actually better for survivors to leave Tulsa and to go to communities, cities in the region, because it was more likely that they would be able to prosper there versus in Tulsa. And so, for communities, right, that experience violence such as what occurred in 1921 in Tulsa, this is their story, the ways in which that violence completely wiped out intergenerational wealth, and much of that wealth was never recuperated. But nonetheless, that didn't deter survivors. They persisted anyway. And probably, the thing that I'm most proud about in the book is that I was able to include my book, The Photographic History. I was able to include photographs of survivors. And what struck me, continues to strike me, is the ways in which, given all that they experienced, they smiled. Mm-hmm. And the smiles, are just tell you everything that you need to know about who these individuals are and what Greenwood was all about. And so I can't answer that question directly, but I certainly think that Black business creation in Greenwood certainly continued thereafter, but it was not the same Greenwood that it was before.
And people actually have a lot of questions sort of exactly about this, the kind of economic success of Greenwood. Could you speak to what is the secret to Greenwood's tremendous economic success?
Well, at the time that it was successful, and one of the witnesses in the film points out, because of segregation, a dollar could turn over in that community several times, and that is not the case today. Someone would get paid $1 and they go down and buy a spool of thread, and that person would take it and go and buy some ice cream, and another one would take it and buy a ticket to the movie theater. That kind of symbiotic relationship is non-existent or does not exist to that extent in the Black community anymore.
Yeah, I would just add to that that there is no secret sauce here. The secret, if there is one, is the people. It was the people that made Greenwood special. Not only was this a community that had 4 Black millionaires in today's dollars in 1921, and at least a half a dozen near millionaires in 1921. Greenwood, Black Tulsa was one of the most educated Black communities in the state of Oklahoma and in the region. The Greenwood district was home to a critical mass of Black professionals, not just ministers and teachers, but doctors, lawyers, real estate agents. I mean, this was a Black community that had that was well educated, was not only well educated, but one of the most peaceful, God-fearing communities in the state of Oklahoma. And so it was the people that made it special, the likes of an O.W. Gurley, a J.B. Stratford, a Mary Parrish, an A.C. Jackson, and the list goes on, a Simon Berry. All of these individuals came to Tulsa, came to Oklahoma, brought their talents, brought their resourcefulness, and through the resilience and the grit, they were able to build Greenwood in a relatively short period of time, maybe 15 years, into a symbol of Black excellence. And so it is the people, it is the people, it is the people, it is the people that made Greenwood special.
And one of the storytellers points out that of the people, you had the uppers and the middles and the lowers. And that was all comprehensive, all encompassing, nurturing, powerful community.
I'm so glad you're talking about the people, because one of the other questions is about where people can read about life before the massacre, about what Greenwood was, and what kind of literature is there out there that you can point people to about Greenwood, about the people before this moment.
Oh, geez, Professor, take it away.
Well, I have here right in front of me. Oh, you can't see it because I have my background, but a book by Carlos Marino, The Victory of Greenwood. It is chock, and this book just came out. It is chock full of stories about the heroic, Greenwood residents who experienced this race massacre, rebuilt the community afterwards. It is chock filled with their biographical details, with the story of how they came to Tulsa, what they did in response to the violence. I would strongly recommend people read this book. But also there are other books. I mentioned Mary Parrish's Events of the Tulsa Disaster. That is the first true history of the race massacre. I would definitely take a look at that. There's been a reprinting of it, so it's now available. It was unavailable, out of print for decades, until John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation began to reprint it earlier. In recent years. I would also take a look at Hannibal Johnson's Black Wall Street 100, that tells the story of the race massacre. Certainly the Groundbreaking by Scott Ellsworth that tries to tell this story. There's a number of great books that center victim survivors and descendants in the telling. But I would start with those books because I think those books are probably the best researched and has the most reliable information in them.
And of course, now thanks to Google and technology, There have been, and because of the proximity of the centennial, there have been lots of newspaper articles and series recapturing the before, the after, and since. I would commend the Washington Post and certainly the New York Times, and I'm sure there are other publications that are revisiting this topic because of the centennial, not to mention a whole slew of other more current documentaries, but they don't have as many witnesses as we had in our.
I know that's right. You got to watch this one. You got to watch this one. I mean, so that tells us, and thank you for that amazing list. I was over here like, you know, how can I keep up with all of the names, all the things to add to my bookshelf? But, you know, also we have to talk about Greenwood after the massacre and after rebuilding. There's a question about what integration did to the community, and that, you know, it had an impact that maybe helped lead to some of the problems that Greenwood has had or has later on. So could you talk a little bit about the impact that integration has, and you know, what ways we should understand integration in this story?
Well, it's integration, yes, but it's also urban renewal, which is referred to in our community oftentimes as urban removal, which namely was a redirection of an interstate highway that cut through and intersected the heart of Greenwood. And that, coupled with the civil rights movement and the beginning of public accommodations and businesses opening up, not as many of our people were keeping their dollars in the Greenwood area or the Greenwood community. And at that point, the white community wasn't coming and spending their dollars there. So integration opened up opportunities in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways, we also lost a thing. I regret that we no longer have all of the varieties of professions living in a close proximity. And there's a saying, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And so those things of proximity and having your teachers go to your same church and being in your community and ready to encourage and discipline you at the same time. Yes, integration brought an opening, but segregation, we lost a lot as well.
Yeah, I would just say in terms of, you know, the more modern history of Greenwood and the Greenwood that is there today, I would say if I were to kind of try to measure out the factors, you know, taking into consideration urban removal and integration, I would say 3 teaspoons of urban removal and 1 teaspoon of integration is responsible for the Greenwood today. And the reason why I would say that is in spending so much time, you know, in the community and talking to community people, but particularly Pastor Turner, he talks about the ways in which Vernon AME had 1,000 parishioners at its peak post-massacre, you know, into the 60s and 70s. And with the 244 interstate that gutted the remaining vestiges of the business district, as well as homes, his parishioners went from 1,000 down to about 130 or so. And so you can see with urban removal, the ways in which it sort of destroyed the last vestiges of the businesses, as well as the community, so much so that today in that area, there are very few homes, that abut against the historic business district or Deep Greenwood, as it was called. And so it is truly the policies of the city of Tulsa that finally, sort of has nailed the coffin in destroying the Greenwood district. And so I would say integration plays a role. It is a factor. The Greenwood district goes from, or in the business community particularly, goes from a place of necessity, because Black people cannot shop. Simply, they just can't shop in other parts of Tulsa, white Tulsa. They can after integration, but also they shop there because the businesses have been gutted. And so I think it's 3 teaspoons urban removal, 1 teaspoon integration, but they both coalesced to destroy the community.
And there's another Asian to consider, and that's gentrification. Whereas the Greenwood community is now close to downtown and is more attractive for speculators, whether they be businesses or residents, for redevelopment. And so it should be a very interesting next few years in terms of what the Greenwood community as a whole will look like. Will it be the seat of the Black community for Tulsa, or will it represent something else?
I mean, there is so much to think about in this history, 100 years, from then to now, thinking 100 years forward, where will we be? We had last week, Viola Fletcher, who was a 107-year-old survivor of the massacre. She testified in Congress. She was 7 years old when this happened. And then we also have, critical race theory opponents who are, doing a lot in states and legislatures around the country to really prevent this same history from being told. So we have our last question, which I asked both of you, and we'll have to keep it short because we're running out of time, but I have to ask you both, where do we go from here? What do we do with all of this story, history, facts, sources, testimony, reparations, repair, all of this? Where are we going from here?
Education, education, education. Teach your children well. I'll leave it at that.
Yes.
Justice, justice, justice for victims, survivors, and descendants. If the 100th anniversary is to mean what it ought to mean, it has to mean, first and foremost, centering victims, survivors, and descendants in the telling of the story. And that should, hopefully, if we tell those stories authentically, lead us to justice. In listening to Mother Fletcher, give her testimony in Congress, I don't know how that doesn't move people to justice. This is a woman who was 7 years old or so in 1921. 100 years later, can tell that story of what had happened to her so vividly, so powerfully, so compellingly, and people are not moved. Who was not? I've challenged someone to say they weren't moved by that. And if you were moved by that, you should be moved to justice, to do the right thing for victims, survivors, and descendants.
Amen.
Justice and education. Yes, yes, yes. Amen. Thank you, Carmen and Karlos. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Here's Cameo George with closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this important and timely Past Forward conversation. Going Back to T-Town is available to stream in full on our website, americanexperience.org. You can watch any of our Past Forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you liked what you saw today, please go ahead and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. Thank you again. Good night.